Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I see that there's many of you from across the world joining us today. Welcome to this webinar on practical tools and initiatives for reducing environmental impact in humanitarian action, which is part of the learning stream on climate change and humanitarian action being organized by ICFA and PHAP. My name is Manisha Thomas. I'm working with PHAP, and it is my pleasure to introduce my co-facilitator, Nishani. Nishani, I'm going to hand over to you, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot. It's amazing to see so many of you from all over the world, from West Africa, the Caribbean, from Middle East, Europe, Latin America, everywhere. It's amazing. So welcome in all sorts of time zones. We're looking forward to an exciting and interesting webinar. For those, again, who are joining for the first time to this learning stream, it's on climate change and humanitarian action. It's a series of webinars where we aim to unpack the commitments of the Climate and Environment Charter for humanitarian organizations and look at how they can be implemented in practice. We conducted an introductory webinar to the Climate and Environment Charter, which was followed by the first topic of the series covering Commitment 1 of the Charter, where we looked at how do we support, strengthen resilience, and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And our last webinar in November, we focused on providing an overview and an initial broad scope of commitment number 2 of the Charter, which is maximizing the environment sustainability of our work and rapidly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. My colleague will share some of the links to these Charter commitments and the guidance that's already out there so that you can access them easily. We recommend that you do listen to the podcast and the recording of the YouTube of our previous webinar, which provides an understanding of the fundamental steps and processes that need to be taken at policy and strategic levels within the sector and by organizations. And on today's event, we will continue to unpack Commitment 2 for you of the Charter and share some practical initiatives and tools that organizations in the humanitarian sector are already working on so that we can inspire you. This is keeping in line with the principles of do no harm, which calls on us to avoid, minimize, and manage the damage we cause to the environment and the climate while maintaining our ability to provide timely and principled humanitarian assistance. And we wanted to tackle some of the key questions that we kept hearing from many of you, trying to practically look at environmentally sustainable approaches in your programs and operations. So some of them are, how can we better implement waste management practices in camp settings? We also heard from Acted in our last webinar that nearly 45% of their carbon footprint was on purchased goods and services. And we heard you ask, how can organizations reduce our environment impact in our procurement processes? Which leads to our next question: how can we measure our carbon footprint and what are the tools available to do so? And last but not least, the other question that we keep hearing is how can we take into consideration conservation practices, more environmental sustainable practices in conflict and fragile settings, let alone normal settings? So what our speakers are sharing today with you are just a few examples, and we know that there's many more initiatives out there. And like our Mentimeter asked, what are the other initiatives that you would like us to talk about? We would also request that you reach out to us and let us know what you're working on related to climate change, local community leadership and engagement, environment sustainability, advocacy and collective action, climate justice, loss and damage, climate financing, which are some of the topics that we want to tackle in this series of webinars to share some of these lessons learned with the wider humanitarian community. So over to you, Manisha, to share who our speakers are today. Over.
Thanks very much, Nishani. And I saw that we've already got a question in the Q&A about how you access sessions 1 and 2. One of our colleagues has pasted the links into the chat, but I think we can probably paste that in again so that you can watch the recordings as Nishani suggested. It's my pleasure today to introduce our 4 speakers who have been implementing various initiatives and are going to be talking to us about those. First of all, we've got Mohammad Al-shushan, who is Senior Recycling Officer with Oxfam in Jordan. He's going to be presenting Oxfam's recycling project in Al-Zatari refugee camp. We then have Jenny Archibald, Global Logistics Advisor on reducing environmental impact with the Norwegian Refugee Council. She will be speaking to us about decentralized procurement and how it affects the environmental impact of humanitarian operations. We'll then hear from Carmen Garcia Duro, who is the Sustainable Supply Chain Alliance Project Manager with the International Committee of the Red Cross. And Carmen's going to be introducing their new carbon accounting tool. And then last but not least, we'll be hearing from Andrew Scanlon from the Halo Trust, lead on global environment and wildlife conservation. And Andrew is going to be telling us about their conservation project in the Okavango Delta in Botswana. So a range of different speakers today. We will be making sure that we have an opportunity for some questions and answers following each of the presentations. But as I mentioned before, we do hope that you will be using the Q&A to share your comments and questions, as well as your own examples in the chat as they are providing their presentations. Before I turn to our first speaker, we are going to take a quick look at the Menti results to see what some of those initiatives that many of you have been working on have been looking at. So we've got NEAT Plus. I still don't know what that stands for, so I apologize, unless it's Nexus Environmental Assessment Toolkit. Thank you for whoever spelled that out. There's the pooling of resources. There is the interest in tools beyond the NEAT Plus. General EIA tools, environmental impact assessment tools is my guess on that one, I'm hoping. We've also got climate vulnerability and capacity analysis. Thank you for the person who spelled out CVCA. Cash and environment checklist, environmental stewardship tool, MSF's environmental toolkit, which is internal, but maybe someone can help us understand what we could learn from that one as well. Fleet Forum's Clean Fleet Toolkit, mutualization and pooling of resources. I think there's some, and then we've also got WRI's initiatives there, environmental and social safeguards. So yeah, I think there's quite a few initiatives out there and tools, and we can take a look at some of those perhaps in more detail in the questions and answers, and maybe some of our speakers will also be speaking to those today. But I think that's a great set of tools already. And I think we have a great lineup today to be able to hear about more initiatives and tools that might be of use to those of you in our audience. So with that, perhaps I can turn over to Mohammad, please, as you tell us about Oxfam's solid waste management and recycling in Jordan. Thanks, Mohammad.
Thanks, Manisha. Hello, everyone. This is Mohammad Al-shushan. I'm working with Oxfam in Jordan Za'atari camp. Nice to meet you all. So today I'm going to speak or to talk about the Oxfam in Jordan and the solid waste management projects that we implement in Za'atari camp and in Jordan in general. We are going to focus on the recycling program in Za'atari camp, with a little bit of introduction of other projects also. So first, we are going to talk about the Jordan context briefly. We have a population of 10.2 million with 1.3 million Syrian refugees, but only 670,000 are registered. We have also the solid waste generation rate in Jordan. We have between 2.2 to 3 million tons of solid municipal waste yearly are generated in Jordan, with the growing annually by 5%. But only 7% of these waste or the recyclable waste are recycled and mainly by informal sector. And it's worth to mention that we have 20 final disposal, but only 2 sanitary landfills. And also the second most water scarce country in the world, unfortunately, is Jordan. Here's the waste composition in Jordan, and you can notice that 51% of the municipal waste are bio-waste, and we have around 35% of the waste are recyclable. But as we mentioned before, that only 7% of the waste is recycled. Now we are going to focus on Za'atari camp and the project that we are implementing there. The project, the overall project is containing many components. The main components are garbage collection, street litter picking, and recycling, with the support from community engagement and to increase the knowledge and awareness also. Here's a map that where we are working. In the green boxes, you can see the host communities, the municipalities that we are working with. Also, we have a Za'atari refugee camp, and the red dot below is the Al-Ihsaniyat landfill, which we are going to speak about it a little bit later. Al-Za'atari camp. Okay, so Za'atari camp is established in 2012 with a total area of 5.2 square kilometers. It's home for 80,000 refugees and around 26,000 shelters. The generation rate is 30 to 35 tons of municipal waste on a daily basis, and all these wastes are collected on a daily basis also. We have some issues regarding the working opportunities inside the camp, and the NGOs there is following the incentive-based volunteering modality, where we can engage people or recruit refugees in Za'atari camp under this program. Here's more detailed camp map. It contains 12 districts. Okay, so let's start with the story of the recycling project and how we established such a project in Za'atari camp. So in 2014, there was a huge number of refugees living in Za'atari camp. We are talking about 150,000 refugees living in the same area that we talked about. And there was a pressure on the solid waste service collection, and it was like an emergency phase. So there was an idea from one of the refugees living there to establish a recycling project where we can target the solid waste at source level. So the people can segregate their waste for two types, the recyclables and the other waste. So we can take all these recyclables from waste stream and to reduce the pressure on solid waste collection service. So it was an idea. Oxfam invested 60 GPP from its own fund to pilot a project for 1 year, and it succeeded. And then we got a fund from GIZ in August 2015 to establish the project. So we started the project in 2016. Then we expanded in 2017 to include 100% of the camp. And it was under DFAT, Australian government, and GIZ, but now it's fully funded by GIZ. So the concept was simple. The household, at their household, the people at their household, they will segregate their waste for two types, only two types, and we can get all the recyclables directly from them, going to a recycling center where we can process all these recyclables. And we measured the impact of this project on the solid waste collection service and how it became more efficient because we reduced all this volume from waste stream. We engaged around 150 refugees to work as an IBVs, incentive-based volunteers, and they are working 36 hours per week. Also, in 2017, we had a massive awareness campaign to elaborate and to convince people how to segregate their waste and what are the benefits of this project on them directly and on the surrounding host communities. So the recycling process is really simple. We have a house-to-house collection. It happens on a daily basis where our trolley workers, we have 100 trolley workers who are collecting the recyclables from house to house. Then they transfer it to recycling centers. We have 2 recycling centers in Za'atari camp. Then the materials is going to be processed, and we have a second phase separation in our recycling centers. We have three main types of recyclables. We have here the cardboard and paper, and the only process that we do on this is baling. We have also the plastics, three main categories: HDPE, PP, and PET. We do some process on them. We have a shredder here on the right, below right, and the picture on the left is the final product that we have. We have a shredded plastic, and it's segregated by type and color based on the Jordanian market requirements. So we can find more people who are interested to buy these materials. The last item is the metals. Also, we have a hydraulic baler to reduce the volume of the metal and to have it in bales, so we can also reduce its volume and make it easy to be transported and sorted. Okay. So the waste journey in Za'atari camp is, it happens at household, of course. Two types of waste are segregated by household. And then we have the recyclable waste collected by trolleys, goes to Oxfam's sorting facilities. Then we sell it to recycling companies. All other waste are collected by Oxfam also, and it goes to the landfill or the dump site near the Za'atari camp. The last stage of these recyclables is going to be sold under a framework agreement to recycling companies in Jordan. All metals and plastics are recycled in Jordan. We have recycling factories there, but the cardboard and paper is now exported outside of Jordan. Here's one of the recycling centers covering 50% of the camp, and here's another recycling center also. So the impact of this project, we have around 76 household participation rate across the camp, and we reached in 2017 we reached 96% of the community is participating with us, and we are proud to say that we are the first project in Jordan where waste are segregated at household level, at source. We recruited more than 700 refugees per month. We recruit them monthly, and it's a huge number of IBVs in the camp. Till now, we collected 4.5 million kilograms of recyclables collected from Za'atari camp and went to the right place. It went to the recycling factories and recycling companies. And all these wastes were supposed to be in the Al-Hsaniyat dump site, which is one of the world's 50 biggest dump sites. And it was operated from 70s, and it's still operating till now. We reduced the pressure on solid waste collection component. Also, we engaged women in a technical jobs in recycling sector. So we have around 20 out of 24 refugees who are working on machines and working on technical aspects in the recycling centers. All of them are 20 of them are women, and we engaged them since 2019. And it's worth to mention that this is the only place that we can give such an experience to women. That's all from my side, and hope you can or hope we can ask some questions after the word. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Mohammad, and for going through a lot of the details there. I think there's a lot of questions that have been generated, but great to see how Oxfam really started with its own funds and then was able to get on board other donors to really fund the entire project so that you're being able to recycle across Za'atari camp. Before I turn to Nishani to pose some of those questions, we do have a poll for you. How did you see this project based on what you heard from Mohammad? We are asking, did you find it inspiring, a priority for your organization, or is it implementable by your organization? Hopefully you can all see the Menti poll there. So again, you can go to the link that has been pasted in the chat or go to menti.com and insert the code 2304-5909. And as you can sort of see, people are finding it a little bit of all of them, inspiring more so than implementable or a priority for people's organizations, but definitely inspiring. And I think that's one of the things that we've been really trying to do with these webinars is provide you with sort of ideas and inspiration so that in your own organizations, you can try and move ahead as well. Maybe, Nishani, we can let people fill that Menti poll in and maybe revisit it. Nishani, I'm going to turn to you for some of the questions that have been coming in for Mohammad, please.
We've been getting lots of good questions. So one is the question from Fiona asking, are you also the solid waste, is this from latrines? Is a question that we've been asked. We keep recurring questions about medical waste and other waste that is not easily recyclable. So there's Anna also asking, how is this problem of existing sorting alone cannot solve this? NGOs don't have the sufficient funding to solve major structural problems of recycling. How does then, how do NGOs then work with government? So if you're working with the government, that'll be interesting to hear. Maybe it's experiences you can share with them. We have another question that's on women participation. We hear that waste management, women tend to consume most of the waste pickers. Can you talk about women's leadership in this? And how have you been involving communities to take on a role to, hold on, sorry, there's loads of questions coming in. I've lost that one. Manisha, did you get that one? The one that you asked was a good one to ask. Yes, did you face challenges in incentivizing the communities to separate the waste and households to separate waste? How did you overcome this, raising awareness, etc.? So some of the questions that are coming in, we'll get back to some of those others as well slowly.
Okay, regarding the medical waste, there's a private sector is responsible for all medical waste, and it's collected by and processed by them. We don't have any access to the medical waste. Also for community awareness and community participation, we in 2017 we have an awareness campaign to tell people what are the benefits of this project on them directly and indirectly. The directly benefits for them was the job opportunities that we provide for them, and also the cleanliness of the camp. Recently, we have an informal sector who's collecting the waste and give a direct incentive for the community, which is one of the challenges that we have in Zaatari camp. As management, we see it as a success story because people now, they are seeing the value of the waste and they are starting to collect them and get benefits out of this waste. But at the same time, we want our project to be more sustained. So we are now studying if we can provide a direct incentive for the people or not. But till now, the motivation of them to participate with us and to sort their waste is to provide job opportunities for each other. So the community is supporting each other, if you get what I mean. Regarding the women engagement, we had a community consultation to ask women how we can engage them in recycling project because all of IBVs were male. So they said that they want more technical opportunities. They want to gain this experience. And we start engaging them inside the recycling centers where they can operate the machines, maintain the machines. Also, they can do some technical things, in recycling sector. And we succeed on this. We saw more and more women are interested to engage with us. We don't have this let's say resistance from the community that women should or should not participate with us. But as usual, we don't see all of the women are interested to be engaged with us. But I can give a quick example that for 18 or 20 positions that we open recently, we have around 200 women who applied for this job. So it's a huge number that the number of women that are interested. Yeah. Is there any question that I missed?
No, you covered them well, and you've actually, when you were talking about it, you covered a few other questions that were coming up. Maybe two more just quickly before we get on to the next speaker is, do you have a handover or exit strategy for this particular project if Oxfam doesn't continue this? Or what's your next steps that maybe others would be interested in partnering? Or how do you see as Oxfam taking this forward? And the other one was, would you look at any recommendations to replicate this as good practice in Cox's Bazar? Over.
Okay. So regarding exit strategy, it's a big question, to be honest. And now we are working with the government in host communities, and we all on the same page. So they understand what we are doing, and at some point it could be the handover could be to the government, so they can take all these solid waste management projects. But we don't have, let's say, a clear partner who can take all these projects after we exit. If we would to replicate this project in anywhere, I recommend the community engagement part, the soft component of the project. It's the most essential one. We need to understand the people, understand their needs, what they want, and they should understand what we are going to do. This is what made us success in Za'atari camp and host communities, and this is the different things that we did than other agencies or the government in Jordan also. So I recommend the community engagement part and the soft component of any project.
Super. Thanks so much, Mohammed. There are lots and lots of questions, so we're not going to be able to get to all of them yet. But a couple ones that I thought might be interesting. There was a question around, why is the waste going into a landfill where it won't degenerate, organic waste, sorry, going into a landfill instead of a compost? Because I think that's a very legitimate question. And then also in terms of the price that you're paying, is it on per kilogram that is collected, or is it on a fixed term basis? And I think also there was another one, are there any, is there any visibility on how much of the waste has been sold? Really that point you said where people are finding it to be a way to make money. Do you have any idea of sort of all that waste that you've collected and the recycling, how much of that has been sold? Is that really a way to kind of generate income?
Okay, first, in Jordan, why not we are composting? We are struggling to manage our solid waste first than the processing them. So we still in Jordan, we don't have a clear or a good management of our solid waste. We don't have also a sanitary landfills. It's 2 out of 20. So we are still in the first step to manage our solid waste. I'm speaking on Jordan in general. In Za'atari camp, there is some plans to get the organic waste and make compost from them, but also the Jordanian regulations regarding using this compost is a challenge. It's a big challenge also, and we can't use this compost for regular use. But there's some plans. I'm talking about Za'atari camp, but unfortunately, it's not clear yet. The price, we don't pay the community regarding what we get from them, but we sell all these materials and we get a price for tons per ton from the recycling companies. If you are asking about the revenue, it goes back to the project budget. And till now we get a revenue of 300,000 euros since 2015. The last question, sorry, I forgot. Sorry about that.
No, I think that was the last question. Now I can't remember what I asked either. Honey, do you remember? Sorry. There's so many questions. I keep reading them.
Yeah.
I think you covered them. Maybe what we can do is also, Mohammed, as we move to the next speakers, maybe some of the questions in the Q&A, if you can provide some answers just in the Q&A, that would be great. And if you have any links, if there's any more details that you can share via a website or something, that would also be really appreciated. So thank you very much, Mohammed. And I know that we've got so many questions. We'll try and answer them either live by typing answers or also maybe at the end. But huge thanks, Mohammad, for sharing that super interesting example with us. We're going to now move over, before I move over, to Jenny, I apologize. Just a quick look at how people found this recycling project in Zatari. A lot of you found it very inspiring, less implementable by your organizations or a priority for your organizations. But I think the fact that it's inspiring is really helpful. And I think the fact, Mohammad, as you mentioned, thinking about the regulations in the country in which you're operating also has challenges in terms of what you're able to do or not. So I think that's also one of the big challenges as we're looking for more sustainable ways that we need to keep in mind as well. So thanks to all of you who responded to the Menti poll. I'm going to now turn over to Jenny from NRC, who's going to be talking to us about decentralized procurement and environmental impact. Jenny, please.
Thank you. Thanks. So yeah, I'm Jenny Archibald. I'm joining from NRC, and I'm a global logistics advisor. I'm responsible for leading our efforts to reduce our environmental impact globally. Today, I'm focusing really specifically on decentralized procurement and how that's links to our environmental impact. NRC does have a very, very decentralized procurement model, and that's been in place for quite a long time now. I'm aware that this is something that's been of interest to lots of organizations because thinking about environmental impact and reducing the weight of supply chains. But for NRC, this was a decision taken quite a long time before and not based on environmental impact. So I wanted to mention some of the other aspects because greening doesn't happen in a vacuum, and some of the other aspects that were why we decentralized our procurement. So one of the biggest factors is actually a very realistic look about the context that we operate in. Centralized procurement, big international supply chains, pre-positioned stock, and shifting huge quantities of stock into a crisis are generally necessary in rapid onset emergencies, but not as necessary in the majority of contexts in which we operate. NRC's mandate is very much conflict displacement. So the reality of the context we work is that they are generally ongoing emergencies, long-term crises, and most of our country offices operate between 10 and 20 years. So with that in mind, we can think about doing things in a different way, and we have opportunities to do more market-based programming, make sure that we are taking a responsible approach in the markets that we operate in, the economies that we operate in. We also can find that there are more efficient, more effective, more flexible approaches that we can take locally without decisions being taken at a global level. So what that looks like is that we don't have anyone sitting in our head office in Oslo who is doing procurement for our programs. That simply doesn't exist in our structure. We have a handful of global framework agreements, very, very, very small number where relevant, but the majority of our procurement is done at a country level. So you will find most of our procurement staff are in our offices in the country in which they're operated in, and even down to area offices and sort of very local to our programs as well. This gives us opportunities to really make use of local markets to, as far as we can, do our procurement as close as possible to the location that goods are being delivered. That obviously gives us a lighter supply chain, so we have less warehousing and less transportation required by the organization itself. However, I do want to highlight the difference, which is really important for the environmental impact between locally procured and locally produced. So although we will do almost all of our procurement locally, that doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility for the environmental impact of the supply chain to get it to that point through the supplier. It does provide some real challenges for monitoring the emissions from that supply chain, but we do have to be aware of where those goods are produced, as well as where they're procured. One of the other both advantages and disadvantages, I would say, of this lighter supply chain and localized procurement is that we have less standardization. So each country can procure the most appropriate goods for their context. However, there are also we lose some of the advantages of standardization, both our ability to monitor the emissions or the environmental impact, but also how we can address that. With thousands of different products, it's harder to target efforts to reduce that environmental impact. We also have many suppliers, so rather than working with a single global supplier, we would need to work with suppliers all over the world. So let me go into a little bit more about once we started thinking about what we can do to reduce that environmental impact. And so the reason that we focused on this is, as was mentioned, Acted found the same. We have quite a light supply chain, so most of our emissions come from the goods and services that we provide to the people we serve. So we really cannot underestimate the importance of considering our procurement when we're looking at reducing our environmental impact. And greening, for us, we do believe that although it's important that we address our direct emissions, as you can see on the left, there are our facilities, our generators, our fleet, and our flights. It is critical that we start to think about how we can address the emissions from procured goods, as well as the local environmental impacts. So thinking again really about that sort of decentralized supply chain, there's sort of two real factors that I want to draw out, which are the real environmental benefits. One is the lighter supply chain. I think I won't overemphasize the point, but we really do reduce the amount of warehousing and storage and the emissions from that, as well as the transportation and goods being moved around as pre-positioned stock and things like that. Even to the point that because we're using local suppliers for some larger goods, I can name many examples where we have asked the suppliers to hold on to large goods until they're ready to be delivered to site. And that just, again, it just cuts down that supply chain and the emissions from it. The other big advantage is how we work with the market and the opportunities to work with local markets and develop more environmentally friendly approaches. There are also challenges, and I alluded to a bit of that earlier in what this means. The local procurement versus locally produced goods. It is often true that the goods that we find in local markets actually are probably less environmentally friendly than we might procure ourselves from an international market. So you may find that many of the goods in a local market have come from halfway across the world and have had less oversight of their production than we might have required if we'd done the international procurement. However, it does mean we have the flexibility to make some choices and to talk to the suppliers about those. Working with thousands of smaller suppliers is more challenging to work with them about greening their processes. They also do not always have access to certification schemes or other ways of establishing how green or not their production is. It's also extremely difficult, and we have just finished our baseline exercise, so I can speak from quite painful experience. It is extremely difficult to try and monitor emissions from a decentralized procurement model. But I don't believe that's a reason not to do it. And that sort of making changes just means that we also need to decentralize how we think about greening our supply chain as well. So finally, and where I actually really excited to talk about, is what we're looking to do next. So we really do have a better idea about what we want, what we need to do, what we've the scale of the problem. But what we're really excited about is what we can do about it. And I would say within procurement, we recognize that the responsibility of organizations goes beyond just buying things, but actually thinking about the source of materials, the lifespan and durability of those materials that we're selecting. Once we distribute them, their usage and how they're maintained, their end of life, and how they can be disposed of or recycled or reused. So taking a sort of becoming taking more responsibility for all of those things enables us to rethink how we do procurement. We do want to work, so we have a very strong emphasis in NRC on working with markets. And we want to increase our market support programming to actually look at how could we do things in a greener way, and what would suppliers need from us if they were going to produce goods in a greener way. We also really want to look at that end of life and that usage maintenance as part of our procurement. So from the start, we are thinking a bit further ahead. So we're looking at ways we can, and piloting ways that we can do all this. We are at the very, very early stages right now, but I'm really excited to explore these areas over this year and future.
Super. Thanks so much, Jenny. And I think that whole point about really trying to see how we have more locally procured items is a really important one, because I think we've also talked about this not only in terms of an environmental impact for a long time, but also in terms of also supporting local markets and local producers. So I think that it's a nice sort of coming together of environmental initiatives and making sure that we're being better for the environment while also supporting local markets. Thanks again, Jenny. We do have a number of questions, but before I pass to Nishani for those, we're going to ask you again around how do you see this initiative? Is it something that's implementable by your organization, a priority for your organization? Is it inspiring? And so far, it seems it's all of those three from the few people that have answered. But we'll let you all answer that and come back to that after a few questions, for which I'm going to turn to Nishani, please.
Thanks, Manisha, and thanks, Jenny. Very interesting to hear what you're doing. And of course, as mentioned, some of these are in the starting process. Some of these projects are ahead of the game. What we're trying to do is share some of the lessons learned, even initially, so that we can inspire you, one, and two, to improve, because we hear lessons learned from everyone else on the call as well, right? So a few questions to you, Jenny, coming from our participants. We've got one on some of the dilemmas that you presented, actually. How do we ensure that environment sustainability procurement is not undermining local small scale businesses? And if we don't invest in their environment awareness and capacity, what are the long-term and short-term considerations on this is one. The other one I think would be really also interesting is to look at the cash and voucher. You mentioned on your distribution of cash and vouchers, and what can you elaborate what emissions are covered by this area that aren't covered in other areas on the chart that you had put out on your presentation? And then we also have Nina, if I'm not mistaken, asking us, in what ways do you facilitate purchasing products and services from women-led businesses, including those which are informal, unregistered, or those which can only go for acknowledgement receipts, and for informed by the principle of equity? And in what ways do you help these local women-led businesses, if that's one? We have a few more. We'll just let you do those two and these three, and then we'll come back to you on a few others that are there on the board. Over.
Okay, thank you. So really taking the first one, I think the dilemma of how we do greening work with markets without excluding local businesses. And I think this is where I think the partnering environmental approaches, environmental greening with market-based approaches is really critical. Not trying to do greening in a vacuum is really important, because some of the principles that we have really tried to put in place for this greening effort is that we will not reduce our emissions at the cost of the people we serve. We know that vulnerable communities have greater impact from climate change and the environmental crisis, and it just seems it would be completely wrong of us to for them to be paying for essentially that greening. So bringing the two efforts of market-based programming and organizational greening together and looking at those together, I think is really important to ensure that not only are we trying to have programs which support local economies, but we're also trying to do that in a way that is green as well, and not shying away from working with like a larger number of local businesses in a way that maybe takes more time, is more effort than working with a single large supplier, but actually having that be part of our goals, I think is the really important principle that we want to have at the heart of that. You mentioned the emissions, and one of the categories of emissions, I don't want to jump in because the next too much on this, because the next presentation is on emissions monitoring, but it is so the reason that cash and vouchers are there is because we do calculate a factor based on how those are spent and the consumption using those cash and vouchers, and the expectations that will of the emissions from their usage, end of life, and the production of goods. It is an estimate, like many of the emissions factors. You'll find direct emissions can be quite precise, and then as we get the more indirect emissions, they are very much an estimate. And finally, you mentioned women-led businesses. Again, this moves us a bit more into that market-based programming approach, and I think the goal for us in terms of greening is that we do keep that principled, market-based programming approach, and that we don't take greening as a separate part of the organization, but that we are working with our sort of programmatic priorities, and that includes things like inclusivity and gender, so that our livelihoods work, our market-based approaches, those are if I'm thinking about greening the way we do procurement, I'm going to work with those colleagues to do it. So I'm not going to try and run this as a separate work stream. So I think that link is the most important there.
Thanks, Jenny. And we have a few other questions. I think some of them were already answered with what you mentioned about, how do we look at the market and ensure that we're not looking at the local aspects of what we're trying to do in terms of our environment footprint, but at the same time, making sure that we're supporting local communities, that we're working with the host communities that we are working with in that area as well. So just another question that's coming in from Danny. Do you have a sense of the breakdown in emissions between different types of purchased goods? Are there particular items that make up the bulk of the impact where you could take a focused approach when trying to help particularly set of suppliers to cut the emissions from their production? I think this goes across the board. Are you working with, there was another question before this, are you working with suppliers to ensure that they're environmentally friendly, or because you have a limited amount of suppliers, especially in country contexts where we work in, right, in the humanitarian sector? The other one was also from Julian, that's interesting as well, is over 80% of humanitarian funding is spent in the same 20 countries during the last decade. What should we be doing to help these 20 countries to develop more environment-friendly humanitarian suppliers? Is this a role for the logistics cluster to pressure suppliers locally? Over for those two big questions.
I think there's some great questions there. So in terms of the breakdown of emissions, yes is the short answer. And this is something that will look different for different organizations, and certainly the different organizations that I've spoken to directly about this, we all have our own little nuggets that are that really core source. So in NRC, it is construction materials. Our work on shelter and settlements has obviously quite a large amount of construction as part of that. Also, our work in WASH involves the construction of water, sanitation and waste infrastructure. And also our education work, which, although not immediately obvious, we do rehabilitate schools quite frequently, and often there's construction involved in infrastructure for education. So those are the sort of biggest contributors to our emissions footprint. And I think this is something we've been really keen to stress with our leadership and with our donors as well, that we've measured this huge footprint from that. We are emitting carbon in order to do good things. So we want to try and find ways of greening, and concrete is the big one, is the big challenge. But what we will not do is reduce the quality of our response in order to do that. So that's the principle that we're working with. It will be extremely challenging, particularly around construction. And I think there was another question around sort of local markets and what's available. And we take I've been stressing the local markets. Our kind of approach is to look first at the local market, then national market, then regional market, and then international market. We have structured our procurement teams so that the bulk of procurement staff sit in the country office or local offices. and if they are not able to find something locally, they can conduct a national or international or regional procurements as appropriate. So it will still be done by the same local team, but yes, they can go. Not everything is always available, and particularly for specialist items, you sometimes have to look further afield. But increasingly, I think we're finding that I would say probably, I don't have numbers for it, but every year I would say more and more is available closer and closer to our programs. And finally, Julian's question about the 20 countries where we spend the most. I would agree, and I think in some ways the market in some ways does that for us, because the bulk of humanitarian spending is in 20 countries. I think that becomes sort of a portion of their economies. I think what the challenge for the sector is actually that we need to recognise that is part of those economies, and actually work with them to ensure that we are that we're procuring in the best way. And I think that sort of local production is something we'd like to look for more, rather than just local procurement.
Thanks. Not easy questions, and you don't have, there's no silver bullet to all the those questions. But thanks for clarifying some of them. And I think there's one more question that we really do want to ask, and maybe Manisha has another one to follow up. Is this is Alison, who's saying, in her experience in Greece, none of the larger NGOs were prepared to wash materials such as blankets, sleeping bags, clothing, and even moldy tents. Instead, they preferred to trash them and replace them. This is kind of related to also waste management and procurement. Not only is this environmentally unsound, but it also doesn't make sense economically. Blankets cost €2.50 to wash, but then hospital standards and a minimum of €7 to buy a new one. And what are your thoughts about this? That's something very practical at the same time, what we face, I guess. And Manisha, do you have something else that I've missed? Sorry, there's quite a few coming in. So
I think we've covered most of them. There is one also about whether you have any measurable environmental targets at an organizational level for the procurement sector. And maybe just to also, as a follow-up to that question around the kind of washing of materials, as you said, Jenny, and as somebody pointed out, it's a really good perspective to have, that you're not going to be making those environmental improvements at the cost of the people that you're serving. So, if we are looking at sort of reusing things or washing things, what impact does that potentially have on the people who would normally often will sell things that they don't need, that they've been given through, NFI distribution. And it's like, they end up with too many buckets or too many blankets, and it becomes a source of income, which I guess leads also to that whole conversation around cash and vouchers is probably a better way to provide aid. But maybe that's getting a bit too broad, but, sort of your reflections on that. It is true. We are in many ways a very sort of caught in a cycle where donors give us very short-term funding. We may not have the money to invest in that kind of the machines that would be able to wash blankets and tents and reuse them. So what also do we need to be kind of working with donors on, I guess, in that sense? I remember seeing a question around that about making donors really understand that they have a role to play in terms of funding these efforts to make a more environmentally conscious choice. Just a few questions for you.
Yeah, and I think sort of a few different across the spectrum there. So let's start with that example raised from Greece, and I think there's a few things to think about there, and I want to just sort of refresh a couple of the things I was thinking about, where I was talking about where we want to go with our procurement, and that thinking beyond just we buy a thing, we give a thing. So starting right at the very start of what we're distributing things that are durable, that are weatherproof, and actually really building into our specifications that durability, that maintainable. something that is not going to disintegrate, that is suitable for the environment, making sure that we're thinking about that and that we're procuring in a way that enables that to be measured. And without getting down a technical procurement route, the comparison of different bids by suppliers, making sure that those key elements of quality are reflected, that we have ways of looking at that, and we have really thought that through in what we're asking for from suppliers, so that we aren't just getting the cheapest item that will disintegrate. So starting from that, then, I mean, it's important to say once we distribute something, it is owned by that person. We won't sort of take it back and sort of maintain it and give it back again. So I think it's really important that we have thought about how will that person be able to maintain it. And in a camp situation or in a community situation, that when we decided to distribute an item, we have thought about, okay, can that person look after it? It's what would they need in order to be able to do that? And the approach that I think normally look for would be to sort of perhaps flag that with my livelihoods colleagues to say, we're distributing blankets. Those are going to need to be washed regularly. This is the requirement for washing them. This is what they would need. Is there a livelihoods project that could maybe start up some businesses to do that? So thinking a bit more sustainable, a bit more long term when we're looking at those things. But going beyond the buy a thing, distribute a thing, we're done. Then what happens when something does need to be? Are the items that we're distributing, can they be recycled? Can they be repurposed? Is there a market for them to be reused or recycled as something else? Having that conversation at the point of procurement, it's hard because we're always under pressure and there's always time constraints and speed. But doing that spending a bit more time on strategy is really what we want to do in order to think through the whole life cycle of a product. And I'm afraid I've forgotten your last question.
It was around donors and how do we sort of convince donors that they, given the short funding cycles that they often have, what is it that we can do to get them to say, we need to be providing more sustainable materials in terms of NFIs or whatever it may be, or, how do we get them on board?
That's a good question. Yeah, so I don't have an easy answer for that, but I think it is important that as a sector that we are accountable and open, that we are having these open discussions about both the challenges and the opportunities to work in a more environmentally friendly way, and that we're also having really open discussions about the cost of greening. So if we want to do programs in a more environmentally friendly way, then that comes with a cost, and we need to ask donors to be prepared to step up to that, because what we don't want to do is provide less support to less people in order to do that. We don't want them to be paying for the cost of greening. I don't have an easy answer to that, but I think it's in the conversations that we have are really important. And something that I would highlight is that everything I've talked about working with suppliers for procurement. So whether if we do market support program where we work with suppliers to supply us with goods that are less that have less of an environmental impact, is also true if we move to cash and vouchers, which does provide more flexibility and dignity and options for the people we serve. We can still work with local suppliers and do awareness campaigns and all of these things to actually work to green the markets even if we are not the customer directly. So I think having that bigger, bolder vision, we are a long way from that at the moment. I hasten to add, I think the vision is there, the direction is there, but we are, really looking forward to working on this.
Super. Thank you so much, Jenny. And maybe I could just add to that one. I think when it does come to talking with donors, they have arms that are not humanitarian funding arms. They have arms that fund development programs. So I think we also need to encourage them to be looking across their spectrum of funding opportunities and how they are supporting countries to also green their own recycling opportunities or composting or whatever it may be. And I think that openness of that conversation, as you said, is something that we really need to be kind of promoting. I mean, we talk about the humanitarian development peace nexus all the time, but we also need to make sure that we're thinking about that as we're looking to green our operations and encouraging donors to do that as well. So just to add that. So huge thanks, Jenny, for that on procurement. Before we turn to our next speaker, just a quick look at sort of how you all saw the initiative of decentralized procurement. Again, more inspiring than necessarily implementable or a priority for organizations, but still roughly a bit of nearly all the same, around 4, 3.5. So thanks very much, Jenny, for providing that inspiration. And hopefully some of you can use that also in your own organizations to really start to reduce your carbon footprints a bit. So with that, I am now going to turn over to Carmen, please. And Carmen is going to be talking to us about a carbon accounting tool for the humanitarian sector. Carmen, over to you, please.
Hi, thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you very much, Jenny and Mohammad, for the very interesting presentations. I think actually my presentation is quite related to what Jenny was discussing. And as you mentioned, is really for, this project of a carbon accounting tool for the humanitarian sector is to make available a tool. So I will not go into details of the ICRC carbon tool or the results, although as it was quite discussed when Jenny was presenting, and also was mentioned by Nish. It was mentioned what was presented in the last time. I want to show here the 2020 results, and as you can see, in green, all that is ICRC programming. Those are ICRC items distributed. So actually, the production of those items is the highest carbon emissions that we have. Fleet and transport, you can see them here in green and blue. Blue is fleet and green is transport. It has, of course, carbon emissions, but really the main carbon emissions is the production. And that's why, as Jenny was mentioning, the quality, the durability is so key for the future and for reducing the emissions. But let me now start with with my presentation. So please, next slide. Okay, let me just go a bit about the agenda. I will go about what is greenhouse emissions and climate change, how it's related. I really also want to emphasize the double role of the humanitarian sector on reducing carbon emissions. I think this is understood by many, but I think we need, as a humanitarian sector, we need to understand that we have a double role, much more than any other company government. Why measuring carbon emissions is important. I will go through ICRC 2030 targets, okay? That actually was also asked, so I can explain about at least how ICRC, what we are targeting. And then I will go into the project of the carbon accounting tool that we are working with many organizations, and some are represented here, and what are the next steps. So next, please. So I don't want to spend a lot of time, but I think it's important that all of us, we are in the same line. So at the end, the greenhouse emissions is quite simple. The sun rays shares some rays that goes into the earth. Then, of course, some of this is reflected and it goes again back to the space. But then if you have high greenhouse emissions, then there is, then this heat, it goes back again, it gets absorbed to the earth. And that's why the earth gets hotter and hotter. Okay, if we look at this, the global temperature from 1880 to nowadays, okay, 2013, you can really see how close they are, the temperature at the in the Earth with the CO2 emissions. And I wanted to emphasize this because I think it's quite important, and it shows the importance of starting measuring of our own emissions in our organizations. So can you please go to next slide? Why is important? You can go to the next one as well. So why is important? There are two roles, and that's what I was mentioning. One is the role that everyone knows is on the TV, on the responsibility that we have in our future generations and all this. But for me, as a humanitarian sector, we really have the do no harm principle. The do no harm principle is really, important for us. Because if you can see in this map, when you look the vulnerability of the climate change, you can really see that actually is where we work. I mean, you were talking before about the 20 countries. Where are the climate change hitting the most? It's not really on Europe or North America. It's really going into Africa, Middle East, Asia. So the people that we are trying to work with is actually the people that is going to suffer more. And that's why for me it's such a big importance that we need to do something about it. Please go to next one. Then why we need to start measuring. I think, and I love this quote of, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage. I mean, I think many organizations, and we started as well to do some things here, some things there, but maybe if we don't really have an overview of where we have our emissions, what is, as Jenny was saying, they did the carbon emissions, so they know exactly where to focus. They know that the water and sanitation, I think she was talking about construction. So in order to be able to understand where to focus, we need to start measuring. And this is something that some organizations have started, but we really need to start, all of us. Even if we start just with one or two scopes, if we really start at the beginning level, because that will be the first step in order to improve. You will understand what data do you need, and then with the years you will learn, and then you will get in a much more advanced. So please go to the next. ICRC commitments. For example, I'm sure many of you have heard about the Climate and Environmental Charter for the humanitarian sector, okay, for the humanitarian organization, sorry. And I know many organizations have already signed it. I want to mention that for ICRC, this has been translated, I mean, it was before the charter, but it has been translated in clear commitments. One of those is reduce the greenhouse emissions by at least 50% by 2030, okay. And another one is better management of hazard waste. So it's really unresponsible procurement. So if you really look at the three commitments, it's really the three presentations that we had today. Hazardous waste management, responsible procurement, and greenhouse emissions. And I think those 3 points are key, and we really need to work with. I work as a project manager in a project that is called Sustainable Supply Chain Alliance. And the first thing that I started when I started with this project was to start talking to different organizations to really understand which each of them they are trying to put in place. Because I think the humanitarian sector, sometimes we work really in silos, and that doesn't help. Because, we all create different things without really learning from each other. And when I did that, I realized that, okay, ICRC has a carbon accounting tool. Norwegian, NRC has also another carbon accounting tool. And we did it completely differently, without having the same methodology, without having the same emission factors. Each of us are really doing it in different ways. It's not right or wrong. It's really that, for example, what is the result of that, it cannot be really shared. I mean, go to the next, please. It cannot be really shared. It cannot really be improved. It cannot be compared. So when I was discussing with others, many people were asking me, but can you share your carbon accounting tool? And then I learned that actually we could not share. First of all, because it was really built for the way that ICRC is structured. It was really has, like a way our budget it is. But I saw the willingness of everyone trying to work together. And that's when we came with this project of really aligning as a humanitarian sector on how carbon accounting should be measured. I think if we all work together, our collective intelligence is much more than if we do it separately. What I mean with this is to start measuring the emissions in the same way within the sector. As I mentioned before, develop synergies, but also to reduce the cost, and also to reduce emissions. I mean, each of us gets different consultants, which are really good, but at the end, they actually get information from other consultants. And if we can actually share, the specifications, we can actually work together and to have kind of the most important part, that is clear specifications, clear methodology, clear emissions factors. Not all of us will have to pay for the same thing because it will be shared and free for everyone, of course. And that will be the first step. And then once we are measuring the same way, then you will be able to compare and say, okay, why if more or less I have the same structure that this other organization, why my emissions are higher or less? And you can talk to them and say, what strategies are you putting in place? How can I reduce it? So, and that's actually the idea that we came in. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So you can go to until the end because there are many. Yes, I thought I was able to move it. And another one is yeah. Here we go. So. We have divided the project in two different phases. The first phase is really about specifications of the carbon accounting. And then the second phase is developing a free and easy to use tool that it will be shared with everyone who wants to use it. We wanted to separate it because we realized that not everyone will use that tool, because, some organizations, they want to have maybe something much more specific for their, for the MRPs that they use, that they take the data directly from the software that they use. But we understood that one thing is the specifications and another thing is the tool that we will build that could also be shared. Then we are about to finalize the first phase. We started, and there are the different steps of what we have been going through since we started in July. Okay, we just before I go through the steps, I just want to say that we are more than 150 organizations that they are participating. Even ECHO is participating in the project to make sure that donors they are also part and understand what are the challenges and what is feasible and what is not. Okay, we started with a webinar on generic needs, and this was really related to make sure that first of all the project was making sense. Okay, that it was not stupid, that actually, people were really looking for something like this, but also to understand between all of us the contents, the consequences, really to also to give the tools to the different people who were participating in that time, for them in order to convince the managers, because normally the people who was participating, they're already kind of sustainable aware, but maybe their managers, they are not. So we really push and give them tools to say, okay, this is the way that you can actually convince for the importance to your managers. That was the first webinar. We had technical workshops with different core groups, okay, in which we really want to understand what should be the basic requirements, what should be the methodology that should be used, what should be the scope, the perimeter should be global, local. We were looking into different things with the different organizations. We also wanted to understand what were the challenges. We were using a consultant to do this, and it's a consultant that they have been already working with different humanitarian different humanitarian organizations to build their tool. But it was very important that they actually had a better overview, not only of the two organizations that they have worked with, but like more global. And I think it went quite well. Okay. After that, we had the Pioneers webinar, which what we did, and it's a shame that the NRC was not part of those. We took, I think it was 8 organizations, which they have already a carbon accounting tool. And what we wanted to do is really to understand what they were, their learnings, the lesson learned, what were the challenges, why they did what they used, the methodology that they used, or something different, to really share, the benefits or the different tools that they have been already built in the humanitarian sector. We thought that was very important if we wanted to really if we really want to move to the next step and to have a proper specification. Then we have a final meeting where we had to go much more into the details of some specifications that they were not clear. There was cash transfer, in-kind donations, and financial support. Okay, now it has been discussed and agreed. But in that moment, we needed to really go into the details because we realized that the different organizations did it in different ways. And today we have the final draft of the specifications that they have been shared with many of you, and that we're waiting for receive the feedback before we kind of close this phase. Then, as I mentioned, the second phase will be the developing and piloting of this tool. That it will go next year from Feb to October. And let's go to the next one, please. These are the organizations that they have been working with us. You also have ECOAT, as I mentioned, and CORT, who is also helping us with the online training. Can we go a bit fast, because I think I'm talking more than 10 minutes. So can you go to the next one, please? Yeah, as I mentioned, European Union is part of it. And then for me, as a conclusion, and this is really to close, sustainability is our responsibility, and carbon emissions is our responsibility, is compulsory, and it should not be an option anymore. Of course, each organization is different. Some of them, they can do much more than others. You know, I used to work in a small organizations. Now I'm with ICRC, but I understand that the capacity could be different, but we need to start. Maybe you just start with the scope of the cars that you have around, but you need to start in that process. And then really the same, what I mentioned before, and I think it has been mentioned also by my colleagues, small actions can have a huge impact. So we really need to start doing it. Okay, so, and then this is the last part of my presentation. Ready for questions?
Thank you very much, Carmen. And I see you've already answered one of the questions in the chat where there was, is there an opportunity for others to get involved? And I saw that you had included your email address there, and maybe we can drop that in the chat as well if people are interested in the pilot. So thank you very much, Carmen, for taking us through that. Before we come to some of the questions that are in there for you, again, we're going to do a quick Menti poll to see, is this something that is inspiring for you, that you could use in your organizations, or that is implementable and a priority for your organization? And I think the fact that, oh, look at that, you've got 5s already.
Wow.
That's one person, but still. But it'll change a little bit. So we'll come back to that. Don't get too excited yet, but it's still inspiring. So, and I think that fact that there's an opportunity for others to get engaged is great. So thank you for that. Nishani, I'm going to pass over to you for some questions, and then we'll come back to the Menti pool there at the end. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Manisha. And thanks, Carmen. Indeed, I mean, your presentation touched upon a lot of the work that has been done and is being done by other organizations, the waste management, procurement, all these things that we were talking about are the ones that we're really looking at trying to reduce our impact, and how do we measure this? And we've got quite a lot of questions about how do we do the monitoring, evaluation, and learning on some of the environment sustainability tools and approaches there are. So, I mean, I'm not sure if you can answer that, but most likely what we can say is that there is quite a lot of tools out there, but what we're trying to do is get a tool that is applicable to across the board. And one of the questions that is coming up is, this tool, can this be used by local, national, smaller NGOs? That's one of the questions that's coming up. Another one that is coming up is, what would this pilot project look like? Can you highlight, and I see this is coming up, highlight the next steps of the project on the pilot aspect. So what does it mean for NGOs to pilot it? And, does that mean there's a huge cost for them to do it? Or what's the level of commitment that NGOs need to take on to do a piloting? I think that will be interesting for organizations to hear from. And also, one of the other examples that we've been asked is, typically, vehicle fuel programs is part of the carbon footprint of humanitarian organizations. Of course, we've been hearing more also that procurement and our services, goods and services, is quite high. Do you know how can practically these steps be taken to look at collaborations between NGOs and vehicle fleets, electric vehicle fleets? Is this something that the ICRC is working on that you could share with others? Maybe some of the technologies that are more affordable in the coming future. And that's something we need to be aware of. It's not all about right now. What we're doing now is to also look at the future and how can we be prepared in the future also to reduce our emissions at the same time. So over on those few, Carmen.
Thank you. So let me try to answer the first one about if the tool will also be able to use for small organizations. The tool, as I said, the tool is not built yet. Okay, it's only the specifications, but what it has been highlighted from the beginning is that the tool needs to serve for big ones and small ones. Therefore, it needs to be quite smart. You need to be able to say, which scope can I do? And maybe as a big organization, you can do the 3 scopes, like procurement, your own warehouses, your fleet, but then maybe as a small organization, you don't have that data because that's the main problem, the data for the 2. You may not have that data. So then you may need to start only with the scope 1 or the scope 2. And then we need to build it in a way that it will take the information and the results will show the information. Also, when working in carbon accounting, one of the main points is the data and the quality of the data. Some small organization, maybe the quality of the data that they get is not really good, but it's already data. So let's start using it, and the tool should have like a way to measure the quality of that data. Okay, therefore it could be used, and that doesn't mean that maybe the quality is not very good because you don't have software that they are looking at how much fuel your cars are using, but you know how much you pay. So at the end you can actually try to use the data in different ways, and that's why it's really. That's what we want to build for next year. This year, build this year, something that is easy to use. And that's the main point of the piloting, because in the piloting, we want to have small organizations. So I answered the second question, small organizations, business organization, national, global, and we want to have that. And when I show you about the core groups that we look at, we already try to get in those core groups during the process, people, different organizations, big, small, local. I remember we have one that was, we had EcoWeb, that is a local in Philippines organization, very good, okay. And then we have at the same time WFP or ICRC, which are there very big. So we really wanted to have this way. But the point of piloting is key, because we can build a tool, but if it's not piloted by these organizations that they will use it after, then it will not be worth it. And if please, some of you want to be piloting, please send me a message. I cannot offer it to everyone, but we are going to choose between 5 and 10 organizations where there are already some that they have been there, but we want to make sure that we actually, the small ones also piloted, because otherwise we will not be able to really see if the tool is good for those small organizations. And then if I go to, you mentioned about the cost. The tool will be zero cost. It's not, the project is being paid, so it's only really, and it's no small effort, okay? It's the resources and the resources to get the data, which is already a huge. So if an organization can really pilot it, they need to understand that they will need to have someone who is there to really look into the data and see ways and discuss with administration, with the logistics teams in order to get that data. And if I go to the vehicle fuel, I think there are many different strategies that they are being put in place. For example, in the movement, what we have started doing, we develop a tool that calculates the CO2 emissions, the safety, and the cost of operations per car, in order really to understand for organization, which are the cars that they should be used, okay? When we look at it, what we have seen, and it has been done also by ICRC and ICRC, we use our different data, is that Land Cruiser, which is what we all use in the field, is really a car that should be only used when it's 100% compulsory. If you are in South Sudan, if you are in a place that is really important, we have Land Cruisers in big cities, in capital, in places that there is no need. Even dusters. Now ICRC and I think many different organizations are using dusters. You can use duster. We have dusters in the north of Mali, in the middle of the desert, and it works. So that just by really having the right car doing the right job, so keeping the Land Cruiser only when it's compulsory, and then having electrical when possible, like in NAME we have electricals, in Americas we have electricals. This is key in order to reduce emissions. And also, I wanted to point that there is with Fleet Forum, there is already a project going on. I think it's WFP, ICRC. I don't really remember the third partner, which is Fleet Forum really wants to start looking at the different organizations that they have electrical cars and start putting the lesson learned together, and at the same time that working with the companies itself, with with Toyota, with all the companies, to make sure that they will invest on having the disponibility, the maintenance of electrical cars in these countries. Because some of us, we are starting, but if there is no maintenance of those electrical cars, we will not buy them. So this project, I think it will be, for sure on the long term, but it will be helpful.
Super. Thanks so much, Carmen. And I think you've got a lot of interest in the chat and the Q&A around people wanting to get involved in the project and the piloting. And since you mentioned you're only going to choose a certain number, maybe you can, in the Q&A, provide a typed answer as, what are the requirements specifically for an organization to be chosen, or, what are the criteria upon which you're going to choose those ones that are going to be piloting, just so that people know and don't spend time coming in if they don't have the requirements necessary to meet that. But huge thanks, Carmen, for talking to us about the carbon accounting tool. And here again, we've got lots of people who have seen it as inspiring, fewer that think it's implementable or a priority for the organization, but still in the mid 3.7, 3.8. And Carmen, thank you for putting your email address in the chat, so anyone who is interested can follow up with Carmen as well. And as Marcus had pointed out in the chat, we have had Mohammad and Jenny providing typed answers to some of those questions that were not answered live. So please look at the Q&A to see the answers to the questions that you may have had or were interested in. So thanks again, Carmen. And last but not least, we're going to move to Andrew for Halo Trust. And I apologize, I said that the project he was discussing is in Botswana. In fact, it is in Angola. So apologies for that. But Andrew is going to be talking to us a little bit about their work in the Southern African region. So Andrew, over to you, please.
Thanks, Manisha. And whether it's Botswana or Angola or Southern Africa or all of Africa, I think it's relevant for my topic. I'm calling it 30 by 30 by 30. And I'm going to discuss a case study of a project that we're working on in the Okavango Delta area. And it's particularly Angola, but I think it's relevant to the global environmental crisis, global environmental action, whether it's in the humanitarian sector. We've heard today 20 countries take up the bulk of humanitarian spending globally. And as Manisha reminded us, the development sector, of course, building on that, is still 51 fragile states and over 90 countries, either in least developed country status through the ECOSOC or in developing country status. We are Halo. I'm working as the Global Environment and Conservation Lead for Halo, and 30 by 30 by 30 means this recent target we heard about in COP26, the Conference of Parties, the climate meeting in Glasgow, and the upcoming biodiversity meeting that's going to take place in China in April, COP15 for biodiversity. There is an aspirational target in there to save 30% of the planet, the most vital places, by 2030. So for Halo, as we develop our environmental work, whether it's the environmental performance type of thing Carmen's talked about, or how we deal with our 10,500 staff, 30 locations around the world, how we deal about our environment performance and the impact of the type of work that we do, which is quite particular in the humanitarian demining space. But really it's about looking beyond even our humanitarian work. And that's what I'm going to try and reflect on with this case study project. And the 30 by 30 by 30 is that in our 30 locations where we work around the world, we would like to be thinking about this idea of we focus on the clearing of hazardous remnants of war. We're doing that in 30 of the most difficult, the most fragile, the most environmentally delicate parts of the world, and they're vulnerable for climate reasons. They're vulnerable in terms of degradation, and they're really important in terms of biodiversity. So this is our challenge to HALO and to the sector, to look at protecting 30% of the Earth by 2030, as much as we can in the humanitarian world. So global environmental action, local conservation projects in the humanitarian demining sector with an eye on 2030. We have core business. This is what we've been doing for 30 years. So 30 by 30 by 30 by 30, manual demining, mechanical demining. We work in the communities where we're clearing on mine risk education. There's a significant EOD component, so explosive ordnance disposal. Things get blown up, there's always going to be contamination and environmental degradation as a result of that. We don't just clear randomly, we do surveys, we work with national authorities, we work with local district governments, other government and non-state actors. We negotiate access to extremely difficult locations. We deal with weapons, we deal with ammunition and the management of those things, particularly in a post-conflict or pretty soon after conflict, and in some cases ongoing fragility situations. We do R&D, research and development, appropriate techniques in terms of our locations, and then we have life after mine clearance. So life after mine clearance might be for the communities, might be for the environment in those locations, particularly interesting to the states, the governments that we're working with. So impact post-clearance and what's life like in terms of agriculture or livelihoods, or in terms of access to areas that pre-clearance were inaccessible. So extremely important work for post-HALO and life after HALO. And that's part of, as we think about 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, the climate targets and the biodiversity targets, that's what we're trying to integrate into our work. We're going to talk about Angola and the most incredible parts of the world. Here we're looking at, I think, the T-51 tank, and with the 22-year-old long civil war that took place in Angola, the amount of minefields that are there, the clearance of battlefields, and well, that's very difficult work. So how do we tag on flora and fauna? Or if you look down in the bottom of the slide there, Falcon vespertinitis, red-footed falcon. What's that got to do with our work in the humanitarian mine action space? And I'd like to say quite a lot. We have, at the moment, an area the size of 2 football fields each second being degraded and lost on this planet. Forest, deforestation, and severely degraded land. So in my 4 minutes of talking, we're losing hundreds of hectares of land. And an area the size of Switzerland is lost on the planet every year, deforested or degraded. And these are often in areas where we're working. So we have in Angola, down in the south of the slide, we have the Okavango Delta, we have the Zambezi River, we have 30% of the biodiversity in Africa in the area. And a very interesting small bird, the falcon, it's trans-equatorial, so it spends most of its time in the Caucasus regions and up to the Paleoarctic, and then it spends the rest of its life in the Afrotropical region, so it overwinters down in Angola. And these are areas that are extremely difficult in terms of terrain, in terms of Angola being still a least developed country, $2 a day average income, and major climate and economic hazards to and risks to the population there. Angola is also has 92% present of the birds of Southern Africa. That's 872 species. There are 5,000 plant species in Angola, especially in the regions of the upper Zambezi and Okavango Delta. And of those 5,000 plant species, more than 1,500 are endemic, means they're only found in Angola. There's 250 species of fauna. And when we talk about HALO's work with conservation and conservation in conflict, we often talk about the giraffes or the elephants, and there's certainly a charismatic fauna to talk about, but I'm going to share some more information about the falcon. It's actually one of those things that, as a migrant, in some ways it's like a refugee, the red-footed falcon, because it's crossing the eastern regions of Africa, the Horn of Africa, through Somalia, and up through the most difficult areas in Syria, and ending up in Abkhazia and in the Caucasus. So it's doing that twice a year, quite a tough journey. As we try to look at the conservation work that we do in this small flagship activity, I've previously shown the core business of HALO, and we continue to do that. Extremely difficult work in 30 of the most difficult places on the planet. So what we try to do is make sure that if we're adding on environment work, we do it on top of our existing programs. So desk studies and planning, it's not that different. When we look at sites, it's a landscape restoration ecology approach rather than a pure minefield or remnants of war survey approach. When we do mine risk education, we can integrate environmental education, especially when we're working with communities in and around the minefield. We have the environmental footprint of our activities. I won't say exactly how many, but a few thousand vehicles, hundreds of premises, and 10,500 staff. Our pollution, our human waste, our solid waste, our electrical waste is a challenge. And we are taking what we would call the waste to value approach from that. So like what Mohammad was talking about in Zaatari in Jordan, we also have in some ways a captive camp condition and situation, and we need to do a better job there. We're starting to do that now. We do a lot of GIS, Geographic Information System work, or Geographic Information Science. And I think the only difference in terms of mine action GIS and conservation GIS is really just at the point data scale. And a lot of the maps, the satellite imagery, and some of the sensor work, including working with drones, is the same techniques and the same technologies. Remote locations, we work places that are hours and often days from the nearest big towns, and the nearest big towns are at least a day's trip from the capital cities. So the remote location work means that we're working in areas where conservation scientists would often like to be, but their own rules and regulations, or university academics, their own rules and regulations don't let them go to those locations. So our access in 30 of the most critically endangered ecosystems on the planet makes us quite a valuable local asset where we have access on the ground. Research and development, we don't really get too deep into academia, but quite a lot of university partnerships there in terms of looking at R&D for a fauna, or in this case, an avifauna, a bird, or working with national universities and colleges in the countries where we work. So what are their national priorities? What resources do they have? And what gaps are there? Impact monitoring, the environment work that we would be looking at doing in the next 5 to 7 years is really long-term. Environmental work needs long-term outlook. Humanitarian work needs quick impact monitoring. So we try and use the conservation in conflict studies that we do to help HALO think outside the box and help the humanitarian mine action sector to think outside the box. How do we do that locally, whether it's with local NGOs, local environmental NGOs, or with other humanitarian actors? How does the humanitarian space and the development space in terms of conservation, environmental conservation, how does it work? And here are some goals to focus on. So when we do our humanitarian work, there are, even in the most fragile countries and the LDCs, there are institutions working with biodiversity. They're working with environment, including environmental protection agencies, most of the countries. So engaging with them in our humanitarian work and planning levels locally. They often need supports, and that's thinking outside the box. It also is, in terms of governance of our projects, I think it's a really great way to build capacity in the countries where we're working for life after our work. We reinforce and work a lot with local communities. We hire locally when we work on mine action, management planning, humanitarian mine action. We also can do that in terms of environmental action planning. And we don't just hire locally, but we build skills and capacity locally. And then for whether it's for environmental projects or restoration ecology work in the future. When we do mine risk education, we look at conservation education as well, the importance of environment, the importance of biodiversity, and the opportunities that environment provides for peace building. If it's GIS, goal number 4 there, I call it Earth Informatics, but it's basically geographic information systems. There's multiple wins there for humanitarian GIS and environmental management, environmental data, and the type of environmental data that we're collecting for mine clearance, mine action, and humanitarian demining is very useful for endangered flora, fauna, and bird life in the areas where we're working. Specifically in Angola, the national parks, the nature reserves, the forest reserves, nature areas, how that network is there and how we strengthen that network and engage with that network provides so much opportunities for the country, the government of Angola in this case, for in the future for ecotourism, working with the national park managers, ecological restoration, forestry, climate action projects, and economic development. Last but not least, goal number 6, and this is really significant, it's happening post-Glasgow COP26. All of the commitments made on finance for climate money, climate finance globally, it looks like up to 30% of the climate finance can be applied to biodiversity type or ecosystem restoration work, even in the humanitarian space. So donors, state donors and non-state donors will be interested to know that they can spend up to 30% of their carbon climate money on biodiversity approaches. And that's, I think, an area we'll see in April in Kunming in China, COP15 CBD, significant opportunities for anyone there working with natural systems. Local NGOs, same thing. Whether it's the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, what they can do through our support, if we're working with restoration or what WFP used to call food for work, it's now called food for assets approaches, resilience and disaster risk reduction, and integrating DRR, disaster risk reduction work into our local community projects. Citizen conservation action. If it's GIS, it's not just our teams working with highly technical Esri or QGIS software, but participatory community geographic information systems. And when we develop local development plans, they can also be local conservation management plans. We try to include local communities in the skills development and the staffing approach, as mentioned, whether it's our local access, our fleet, our operations, our premises, and procurement systems, that local deployment and local applications for life after mine action is really critical. So working with the citizens on that as we are working. And then also very much the humanitarian education messages that we are already delivering, trying to include quite a lot more environmental education messaging there too. And just a quick example of when we think about what this would actually mean practically. Well, the conservation world and the mine action world back in the 60s and 70s, there was very few women involved. And one of the initiatives that Halo has been leading to fantastic success is it's called 100 Women in Demining, and building skills and helping to build vocational and technical capacity in mine clearance. Very difficult work for women, but that's making significant effort in humanitarian action. But it also, we think about considering the environmental impact, women in environmental action, women developing skills, women and girls really. You have to start at high school and college level. But that's a sustained global impact post-humanitarian crisis. Gender leadership opportunities for women and girls. And the conservation world these days at senior and technical level is dominated by some fantastic women and girls. And we think about Jane Goodall, who started her work back in the 50s and 60s. And I think in the conservation world where we're working, we're trying to build on the women in demining and extend that more into women and local environmental action as well. 30 by 30 by 30, we focused on clearing hazardous remnants of war. The Halo Trust working in 30 of the most difficult, fragile, environmentally vulnerable places on the planet. These sites are also vital to protecting 30% of the Earth by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And hopefully that'll give some more inspiration to people. We are running a bit short on time, so I'm going to suggest we skip our usual Menti poll for this. Sorry for that, but you can write in the chat if you're interested. And I'm going to turn to Nishani for a couple of questions that we've got for you, Andrew, before we do a bit of a wrap up and finish in 7 minutes. Thanks. Nishani, please.
Yeah, we've got some interesting questions. One of them is, we've talked about, how heavy equipment is also an impact on the carbon footprint and our environment impact. So do you have are you working with dogs up front to reduce and narrow down the areas where heavy equipment could be used for clearing? Is something that Stephanie is asking. Of course, Fiona has a question, guess the only way to reduce demining environment pollution is to ban landmines and remnants of war. Are you working on some advocacy on this with donors and governments that are looking at demining aspects and banning landmines? And the other thing that's also interesting that's come up, it's a bit of a big question, is how do we demonstrate the long-term business case for greening donors, focusing on the short-term efficiency and maximizing response? Few questions there to kind of tackle in a short time over.
Very quickly, yeah, the environment impact directly of clearing remnants of war, and it's not just tank mines, personnel mines, it's all remnants of war, including IEDs and unexploded ordnance. It's a part of an ongoing life cycle analysis. What's necessary, what do we need to do, what would be nice to do? There's always going to be a payoff in terms of time, efficiency, and what's known in the mine action world as best reasonable effort. At the end of the day, whether it's children or animals or farmers or users of the land, we have to make sure that it's safe. And that is the first priority. The mine action sector has international mine action standards. A lot of them are under development. We're involved at the moment in a lot of those standards ourselves, although we are an executing partner. The UN agencies that are involved and other international and national mine action agencies are involved in those standards. The vehicles is a big part of that, whether it's moving away from diesel to hydrogen or electric. There's different options out there, but at the end of the day, again, when you're 2.5 days travel from the capital city of the country in context, it's difficult, and we have to do that. But we're definitely looking into it, and part of my job would be to do a footprint and environmental performance for us in the next couple of years. In terms of Fiona's point about not getting remnants of war into the ground in the first place, yes, Fiona, if we can stop war and find a solution for global peace, that would be fantastic. Let's work on that. And then in terms of the long-term business case, I think there is significant opportunities right now for the humanitarian space to engage with the environmental finance. I mentioned the 30% of biodiversity funds in the next 18 months will be allocated for climate actions. Unfortunately, there's no biodiversity fund, but there is a climate fund, and we should be engaging there. But pure climate investments, as they are being currently suggested, I think they're going to end up just being counting in terms of carbon, but not counting in terms of quality. And I think that's something we can look at with environment finance. Happy to talk about it more in future events.
We'll be definitely having and discussing climate financing, and hope we can engage on that topic more. Manisha, I'm going to hand it over to you. I know there's another question there, but maybe Andrew, you can respond to that.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Nishani. And yeah, Andrew, there is a question around how you engage with sort of translators and interpreters to make dialogue as transparent as possible. as they also have a key role in the climate crisis. So if you could answer that, that would be great. Huge thank you again, Andrew, and to all our panelists for what has been an incredibly inspiring set of presentations around different aspects of the response that humanitarians can have to the climate change and to making sure that we're doing better for the environment. I'm really sorry that I'm not going to be able to come back to each of you, but I really just wanted to highlight, Mohammad gave us some great examples around how they're tackling recycling and waste in Jordan, Jenny about procurement and localizing that as a way to really reduce our carbon emissions, Carmen around the carbon accounting tool, and there's an open invitation for everyone to join that piloting process and to really see how to use that tool in future. So get in touch with Carmen, and Andrew really highlighting how you're working on the 30 by 30 by 30, but really that we do have a role to potentially play also in how we affect flora and fauna, and really thinking how we can bridge humanitarian work and really looking at our impact on the climate. So really thanks to our panelists, and thank you to all of you in the audience who have provided such an amazing wealth of questions and also examples of tools and initiatives that you're working on. And thank you to our panelists for responding to all of those questions, also in writing. I know, Mohammad, you had a lot in particular. You've been busy typing away, as have you, Jenny, since you both did the first presentations. I think the questions started wearing out after that because I think you got so many of them. But huge thanks. And I think this has really been another opportunity as we've been exploring through this webinar series about what it is that we as humanitarians can do. And I think that point, Carmen, you raised is it's super important for us as humanitarians to do no harm. And we really need to be considering that in our work, really thinking about what can we do on top of our work for people who are affected by crises, conflicts, and disasters. How do we do that in a way that really empowers them and helps them also contribute to reducing greenhouse emissions, and that collectively we're reducing our impact on the environment and on climate change as well. So while we don't necessarily have a silver bullet, we have lots of ways to be working together. And as somebody pointed out, we don't do our work in a vacuum. We have to be really considering more holistically what it is that we as humanitarians are doing that contributes to climate change and to greenhouse emissions, and really trying to work our way in reducing that as we move forward. So huge thanks. Before I say where we get the recording, Nishani, a few words from you finally before we wrap up.
No, very inspiring, as we mentioned, but I think more than inspiration, if we can take that inspiration and put it into practice, reach out to the speakers, reach out to us if you want to connect with them. They've shared their contacts with you. I think we can do this. Scaling up is not always easy, but how do we look at replicating some of these initiatives in your own programs and operations, and to see in your own work that you're doing, and to look at how do you talk to your colleagues. That's the other thing, right? It's a bit of a behavioral change, mindset change that needs to take place. And honestly, looking at environment as a holistic approach in all our programs we do, and not just piecemeal humanitarian. And we talk about the humanitarian development peace nexus. This is the other one where we really need to connect at country level. And if you're working at country level, it's all about advocacy at your HCTs, at your country level offices, even just within your own organization, to talk to each other and see where you can link up and work better together to look at these options. And we look forward to future webinars. I have put in my contacts and my colleagues' contacts, Antonella, so that you can reach out to us to share some of these lessons in our future webinars on the various topics that will touch upon the Climate and Environment Charter, and how do we minimize our environment footprint, and also look at building resilience and looking at adaptation in climate change impacts. Over.
Thanks, Nishani. And just a couple last words from my side. We do have a recording of the event, both in video and audio only podcast format, which will be available on that website in the coming days. You'll have also seen Vaughn has pasted in a quick survey for you to do about the webinar. Your feedback is super helpful for us improving future ones. And finally, a huge thank you to everyone who's participated. Our 4 fabulous panelists, Nishani, my co-facilitator, thank you. And Ellen also for providing the live transcript. And thank you again for all your questions and engagement. And we look forward to seeing you at a future one. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.